Millions of people have spent, centuries picturing the exact same scene for the Last Supper.
Oh, absolutely. It's iconic.
Right. It's totally ingrained in our cultural bedrock. You've got Jesus and the disciples gathered around a table, eating unleavened bread, partaking in the traditional Passover lamb.
Usually on a Thursday night.
Exactly. A Thursday night right before a Friday crucifixion. But, what if almost every structural element of that picture is wrong?
Yeah.
Like the bread, the lamb, the timing, and specifically the actual day of the week? What if all of that is completely misaligned with the historical and biblical text? What if that meal wasn't the Passover at all?
It's a deeply unsettling question, honestly.
Yeah,
Especially for anyone who likes their history, neat and settled.
for sure.
Because when you start pulling at the chronological threads of this particular narrative,
Right.
the entire tapestry of what we assume happened during that week just begins to unravel.
It really does.
You're suddenly forced to look at the mechanics of ancient timekeeping and translation errors and the deeply rigid religious laws of first-century Jerusalem.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today is Sunday, March 29th, 2026.
A great day for a deep dive.
It is. And as we move into spring, which is a season historically anchored by ancient calendars and Passover traditions, it really is the perfect time to examine how time and translation actually shape belief.
Definitely.
So for you, the listener, whether you are, a massive theology buff, a history enthusiast, or just fiercely curious about how foundational narratives are constructed, we are taking you into the architecture of a massive chronological puzzle today.
And our source material for this exploration is, it's a highly detailed, very analytical transcript from a YouTube channel called Vital Christian Issues.
Right.
The specific presentation is titled The Laird's Last Supper, The Untold Version, Part 1, His Hour Have Come.
And our mission today is very specific. We are going to deconstruct the traditional narrative of the Last Supper, relying entirely on the arguments presented in this source.
Yeah.
Because the speaker proposes a radically different chronological and spiritual timeline, we're going to map out the exact days, focusing purely on this material's assertion that the 14th of the month was unequivocally a Wednesday.
Wednesday the 14th. That is key.
Right, and that the 15th, which is the High Sabbath, was a Thursday. And from there, we'll unpack the monumental structural significance behind that phrase repeated in the text, which is, his hour have come.
But before we even touch the calendar or, the translation of specific words, we really need to establish the parameters of how we're handling this material.
Oh, absolutely. A mandatory impartiality disclaimer is definitely required here.
Yeah, let's get that out of the way.
Because the source material we're diving into contains deeply theological, intensely debated religious interpretations. So we are taking absolutely no sides.
None whatsoever. Our objective is entirely impartial.
Totally neutral.
We are just here to accurately, respectfully, and thoroughly report on the arguments, the linguistic breakdowns, and the chronological frameworks that the speaker presented in the original text.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing these viewpoints as absolute truth, and we aren't here to debunk them either. We're simply acting as your analytical guides, laying out the speaker's case so you can examine the mechanics of his argument for yourself.
Well said.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the foundational premise of this source doesn't actually begin with the timeline of Wednesday or Thursday.
No, it doesn't.
It actually begins with a rather severe critique of how human beings process ancient texts in the first place. The speaker sets up this hard boundary between the intellectual mind and what he calls spiritual revelation.
Yeah, the source establishes this dichotomy right away. The speaker expresses a deep frustration. I think he mentions listening to theological arguments and debates since 1986.
Wow, that's a long time.
Right. And his core conclusion is that the vast majority of intellectual minds simply cannot grasp the things of God without the intervention of the Holy Spirit.
Oh.
He essentially argues that human intellect, when it's operating on its own, is fundamentally ill-equipped to decipher spiritual realities.
I want to push back on that right away, just to represent the listener's natural skepticism here.
Sure, go for it.
Isn't human intellect like our capacity for reason and creativity? Isn't that exactly the tool we use to understand complex history?
That's the usual assumption.
Yeah. I mean, we use our minds to translate languages, build historical models, cross-reference ancient manuscripts. Why does the speaker view the creative human mind as an obstacle rather than an asset?
Well, it's a crucial question. The speaker does acknowledge that humanity was given incredibly creative minds by a creator.
Right.
The problem, according to the source, isn't the intellect itself, but how that intellect is applied in the context of what he calls spiritual warfare.
Your spiritual warfare.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the source posits that humanity was born into this world as slaves to sin, operating in a state of spiritual darkness.
Mm.
And in that state, the human mind doesn't naturally seek objective spiritual truth. It actually seeks to validate its own existing paradigms.
Oh, confirmation bias, basically.
Exactly. So when the creative human mind encounters a text that challenges its traditions, it uses that creativity, not to understand the text, but to twist the scriptures to fit its own preferred ideologies.
Oh, wow. So it's about the human tendency to smooth over the rough edges of a narrative.
Precisely.
Like, if an ancient text presents a timeline that feels counterintuitive to a tradition we've celebrated for centuries, our intellect will just rationalize a way to make it fit.
We'll bend over backwards to make it work.
Right. We'll adjust a definition here, ignore a logistical impossibility there, just to keep the foundation of our tradition intact. It's kind of like an overeager film adapter completely changing the ending of a beloved book just because it made more sense to them for the movie version.
That is a perfect analogy.
Mhm.
And the source directs this critique specifically at biblical translators.
Oh.
This is a really vital mechanism to understand.
Yeah.
The speaker warns that just because a word can be translated a certain way from ancient Hebrew or Greek into English,
Yeah.
that doesn't automatically mean it reflects the original spiritual truth of the text.
Let's drill into the mechanics of that for a second. Because
Okay.
translation isn't just a simple one-to-one math equation, right?
Not at all.
Words have semantic domains, ranges of meaning. A single Greek word might have, I don't know, 3 or 4 possible English equivalents depending on the context.
Exactly.
So the source is suggesting that translators, burdened by their own intellectual traditions, will consistently choose the English word that supports the established narrative, even if the surrounding context practically screams for a different choice.
That is the exact danger this speaker is highlighting here. He describes the original events as a spiritual rescue mission.
Okay.
He says the Father had to redeem mankind from a world of darkness, which is an operation taking place in a spiritual realm that the carnal human mind simply cannot perceive.
Right, it's invisible to the intellect.
Right. Therefore, if translators approach the text merely as a dry historical timeline that needs to be reverse engineered to fit, say, a Friday crucifixion tradition.
That is what everyone assumes.
Exactly. If they do that, they will actively, if unintentionally, slaughter the original intent of the text. The foundation of the truth remains the same, but generations just add twists, theories, and slight adjustments that obscure the reality.
What's fascinating here is how the speaker transitions from this broad warning about human interpretation into the very concrete, non-negotiable laws surrounding the Passover.
Yeah.
He makes a very deliberate point to establish Jesus' relationship with these physical customs. He references Luke 2.41 and 4.2.
Yeah, the text points out that Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every single year at the Feast of the Passover, and that Jesus himself had kept this custom perfectly since he was 12 years old. The source really emphasizes that this was the Jews' Passover.
The Jews' Passover.
It was a rigid, universally understood tradition governed by strict Levitical law. The 14th of the first month was the appointed day.
The 14th.
Yes, that was the day the lambs were examined, and that was the day they were killed.
So the source goes completely out of its way to establish that Jesus was a devout, law-abiding participant in this system.
Completely devout.
He never broke the customs. He kept the law perfectly his entire life, which makes the central claim of this source so incredibly jarring.
It really does.
The claim being the Last Supper, the meal they ate in that upper room, was not the Passover meal.
This is the linchpin of the entire argument.
Hmm.
To understand why it wasn't the Passover, we really have to meticulously map out the chronological framework that the source demands.
Okay, let's do it.
We have to basically discard the traditional Friday crucifixion timeline entirely and build the week exactly as the speaker lays it out.
Let's build the architecture of this timeline based purely on the material provided. We have to anchor this to the 14th and the 15th of the month. So walk me through how the source assigns the days of the week.
According to the source, the immovable anchor point is Wednesday. Yes, Wednesday is the 14th of the month. Consequently, Thursday is the 15th of the month.
Let's stop right there and clarify, because to a modern listener, dates and days of the week shifting around like this can get pretty confusing.
Oh, easily.
In the Jewish calendar, the days technically begin at sunset, correct?
Correct. But for the sake of mapping the events as the source describes them, let's just look at the daylight hours to keep it simple.
Okay.
Wednesday the 14th is the preparation day.
Preparation day. Got it.
This is the day mandated by law for the Passover lambs to undergo their final examination to ensure they are without blemish. And it is the day they are systematically slaughtered in the afternoon.
And according to the source, this is the exact day Jesus is crucified, Wednesday the 14th.
Precisely. Wednesday morning is when Jesus undergoes his final examination, his trial before Pilate.
Oh, I see the parallel.
Right. He is found without fault, perfectly mirroring the examination of the lambs, and he is crucified that same day, the 14th.
Which means the next day, Thursday the 15th, is the actual Passover.
Yes.
The source refers to Thursday as the High Sabbath. I think we need to explain the mechanics of a High Sabbath for the listener, because usually, we associate a Sabbath strictly with Saturday.
That is a very common point of confusion that traditional timelines often gloss over.
Right.
In Levitical law, the weekly Sabbath is always the seventh day, Saturday.
Always.
However, the law also instituted specific feast days, like the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which begins on the 15th of the month.
Okay.
These feast days were designated as days of solemn rest, regardless of what day of the week they fell on. They're treated exactly like a weekly Sabbath.
So because the 15th of the month happened to fall on a Thursday that specific year, that Thursday operated as a High Sabbath.
Exactly.
No work could be done. And the Passover meal was to be eaten at the beginning of that High Sabbath.
You got it. The timeline the source insists upon is this. Jesus is crucified on Wednesday the 14th, the preparation day. He has to be taken down from the cross and buried before the sun sets.
Because if the sun sets...
Because once the sun sets, Wednesday ends, Thursday the 15th begins, and the High Sabbath initiates. And you absolutely cannot handle a dead body or do the work of burial on a High Sabbath.
Okay, so if Wednesday the 14th is the crucifixion, let's back up to the Last Supper. That would place the supper on Tuesday evening.
Yes. Tuesday evening, which transitions into the night of the 13th, is when Jesus and his disciples sit down in the upper room.
Tuesday night.
Right. It is a supper.
Right.
But logically, logistically, and legally, the source argues it cannot possibly be the Passover meal.
Let's lean into that friction for a second. If Jesus is a devout Jew who kept the law perfectly his entire life, why would he hold a rogue early Passover supper on a Tuesday?
Right. Doesn't make sense.
Wouldn't that invalidate the entire tradition? If he's supposed to be the perfect fulfillment of the law, breaking the timeline seems like a massive contradiction.
That is exactly the logical barrier the source uses to dismantle the traditional view. Think about the environment in Jerusalem at that exact moment. The Pharisees and the religious leaders were actively, aggressively hunting for any legitimate reason to arrest Jesus.
They were watching his every move.
Exactly. The law of Moses was the absolute authority. It was a perfectly tuned clockwork machine of rituals and dates.
Right. And if you have a massive public clockwork machine where millions of people are watching the gears turn, you can't just decide to make one gear turn 24 hours early.
No, you can't.
Like, it reminds me of filing taxes. If the absolute IRS deadline is April 15th, and a highly public figure proudly declares they're doing the official ceremony a day early using completely different forms, the auditors, which in this case are the Pharisees, would instantly flag it.
They absolutely would. If Jesus, who had millions of eyes on him, suddenly decided to gather his disciples and slaughter a Passover lamb on Tuesday, a full day before the mandated preparation day on Wednesday, the entire religious establishment would have descended on him instantly.
The Pharisees were just waiting for a single gear to slip.
Yes. If Jesus slaughtered a lamb early, they wouldn't have needed Judas to betray him in secret.
Wow, yeah.
They wouldn't have needed to manufacture false witnesses at his trial. They could have arrested him in broad daylight for blatantly violating the core laws of the Passover.
They would have accused him of heresy on the spot.
Exactly. Yet, as the source points out, there is absolutely no biblical record of the Pharisees ever making this accusation against him.
Furthermore, the source brings up the logistical mechanics of the sacrifice itself. It wasn't just, a backyard barbecue.
No, not at all.
The blood of the slaughtered lamb had to be dealt with according to very strict priestly protocols.
Yes, the blood of the Passover lamb had to be sprinkled on the altar by the Levitical priests in the temple.
Right.
If Jesus and his disciples killed a lamb 24 hours early in a private room on Tuesday, what did they do with the blood?
Right. Did they just walk into the temple a day early and demand the priests sprinkle it?
The priests, who were already actively conspiring against him, would have absolutely refused.
So a rogue early private sacrifice was logistically impossible in the highly regulated environment of first century Jerusalem.
It just couldn't happen.
Mm.
So the source concludes that because there was no uproar about an early sacrifice, and because a private sacrifice was impossible, there was no lamb eaten at the Last Supper.
Wow.
It was Tuesday. The lambs weren't slated to be killed until Wednesday afternoon.
Which leads the speaker to a very pointed critique of modern assumptions. He notes that across more than 20 different biblical translations, not a single gospel writer explicitly calls that specific immediate meal a Passover meal.
Right.
They just call it a supper.
He also brings in Old Testament prophecy to support this. He references Psalms 41.9, written by King David some 900 years before these events.
Okay.
It's the prophecy about a familiar friend, someone who did eat of my bread, lifting up his heel in betrayal. The source highlights two crucial omissions in that prophecy regarding the Last Supper.
What are they?
First, there is no mention of a Passover lamb in the prophecy of the betrayal.
Interesting.
Second, and equally important, there is zero mention of unleavened bread.
That is a massive detail, because the traditional imagery, the paintings, the movies, they always show them breaking unleavened bread.
Always.
But the source argues that readers and translators have simply retroactively projected unleavened bread into the narrative because they assumed it was a Thursday night Passover.
Exactly. The text simply says bread.
Just bread.
Yeah. If it were the actual Passover meal, the specific requirement of unleavened bread would be paramount. But because it is Tuesday, the Feast of Unleavened Bread hasn't started yet. They are just eating a normal supper with normal bread.
Okay, I'm following the logistical argument for Tuesday. But to make this Wednesday the 14th, Thursday the 15th timeline actually hold up against the biblical text, the source has to redefine a word that seems pretty straightforward to us.
Yes.
The word evening.
This is perhaps the most technical linguistic mechanic the source addresses.
Let's get into it.
In modern English, when we use the word evening, we almost exclusively mean the time right around or immediately following sunset.
Right. It is the transition from day into night.
Yeah.
Like if I say, I'll see you Tuesday evening, I mean after work, as it's getting dark.
Exactly.
If the biblical text says something happened in the evening, our modern intellectual minds automatically assume the sun has gone down and the next Jewish day has begun.
But the source insists that the biblical definition of evening is fundamentally different from our modern English usage.
How so?
Biblically, according to the speaker, evening refers to the later light part of the day, before the sun actually sets.
Explain the evidence for that, because that is a massive semantic shift. If evening means the sun is still up, that changes the timeline of everything that happens near the end of a day.
It changes everything. The speaker provides two highly specific pieces of textual evidence to prove this definition.
Okay.
The first piece of evidence is Mark 15.42. The context is Wednesday the 14th. Jesus has been crucified and has died on the cross. The text explicitly states, and now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that verse. When the even was come,
Right.
Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate to ask for the body. But the verse explicitly clarifies that it is still the preparation day.
Yes.
It is still Wednesday the 14th.
Exactly. If evening meant that the sun had set, then Wednesday would have ended. The high Sabbath Thursday the 15th would have officially begun.
And if the high Sabbath had begun,
Then Joseph of Arimathea would not be going to the Roman governor, buying linen, taking a body down from a cross, and performing a burial. All of that labor was strictly forbidden on a Sabbath.
therefore, the word evening in the text must describe a time when the sun is still up.
It has to.
It has to mean the late afternoon. It's the time of day when you realize the sun is getting low and you need to finish your work before the new day actually starts.
The logic is airtight when applied to the Jewish calendar rules. And the second piece of evidence the source provides is from the post-resurrection appearances. The text looks at the Sunday, when Jesus appears to the disciples. The scripture refers to that moment as the same day at evening.
Oh. The same day. It doesn't say, and then Monday began. It was still the first day of the week. The sun hadn't set to trigger the start of Monday. It was just the later light part of Sunday.
So by establishing that evening means late afternoon before sunset, the source secures the Wednesday timeline. Jesus dies in the afternoon of the 14th. Evening comes,
Yeah.
the late afternoon. Joseph of Arimathea rushes to bury him before the sun sets, and the Thursday high Sabbath begins.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This careful chronological mapping unlocks a detail in the text that, honestly, is one of the most brilliant deductive points in the entire
I
source.
think I know which one you mean.
It involves Judas Iscariot and a massive logical contradiction that we usually just completely gloss over.
You're referring to the moment during the Tuesday night supper when Jesus dismisses Judas.
Yes, they're at the table. Jesus tells Judas that thou doest, do quickly, and Judas leaves the room. What is the immediate assumption of the other disciples sitting at the table? As theology buffs know, the text in John 13:29 says that because Judas held the money bag, some of them thought Jesus was telling him to buy those things that we have need of against the feast.
Let's analyze the logistical absurdity of that assumption under the traditional timeline.
Please.
If they're already sitting down on Thursday night, actively eating the Passover feast, why on earth would the disciples assume Judas is being sent out to buy things for the feast?
It makes no sense. It's literally like sitting down at the table for Thanksgiving dinner, the turkey is carved, everyone is actively eating, and then the host tells someone to leave, and you assume they're going to the grocery store to buy the Thanksgiving turkey.
Right. Furthermore, consider the environment of Jerusalem during the Passover. The city's population swelled massively. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims were there.
It was packed.
If it was already the night of the feast and the strict laws of the Sabbath were in effect, the markets wouldn't be operating normally.
And as the speaker points out, if they were supposed to be eating unleavened bread for a 7-day festival, they wouldn't be sending their treasurer out into the crowded, chaotic night markets during the actual feast to buy more bread.
No, they would have procured all the necessary supplies well in advance.
This is a perfect example of what the speaker meant earlier about the human mind smoothing over texts.
Exactly.
For centuries, readers have ignored the glaring logistical inconsistency of Judas going shopping during a sacred, strictly regulated feast, simply because they are deeply committed to the traditional Thursday night timeline.
But the moment you apply the source's timeline, that this supper is happening on Tuesday evening, the 13th, the detail about Judas makes perfect practical sense.
Because it's Tuesday.
Yes, the markets are still open, the preparation day isn't until tomorrow, the actual feast isn't until Thursday. The disciples assume Judas is going out to do some early, prudent shopping for the upcoming festival.
The timeline resolves the contradiction completely,
Yeah.
but resolving that contradiction immediately forces a much deeper question.
It does.
If this Tuesday night dinner wasn't the traditional Passover meal, what was the urgency? Jesus deliberately gathered his 12 closest followers for this specific, highly orchestrated supper. If it wasn't about eating lamb and bitter herbs to fulfill the Levitical calendar, what was the agenda? Why gather them on Tuesday?
The answer the source provides requires us to look at the overarching cosmic schedule Jesus was operating on.
Okay.
The text repeatedly emphasizes a highly specific phrase, a trigger that sets all the events of this week into motion.
I know this one.
The phrase is, when his hour have come.
This phrase really is the engine driving the narrative. We see it in Luke 22:14, which states that Jesus sat down because the hour was come.
Yes.
And we see it in John 13:1, which is incredibly explicit. It says that before the feast of the Passover, which again corroborates the source's argument that the feast hadn't happened yet, Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of the world.
We really have to analyze the mechanism behind this hour, what triggered it. Because Jesus had been ministering for years. He had faced opposition before. On multiple occasions, crowds or religious leaders tried to seize him or stone him, and the text explicitly notes that he slipped away because his hour was not yet come.
He was entirely in control of his timeline.
Completely. So what changed on this specific Tuesday? Why didn't he slip away this time?
The source points directly to a moment recorded in John 12:23. Jesus suddenly proclaims, "The hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified."
Yes.
And the event that precedes this proclamation is structural. It's a massive paradigm shift. The text says that certain Greeks had come up to worship at the feast, and they approached the disciples asking to see Jesus.
The arrival of the Greeks.
Yeah.
The Gentiles.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we need to unpack the theological weight of this demographic shift according to the source.
Okay, let's unpack it.
Up until this specific moment, Jesus' physical earthly ministry had been rigorously localized. He was directed almost exclusively toward the Jewish people, the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
He was a local Jewish Messiah operating within the framework of the Old Covenant.
Yes.
But during this specific festival season, the outside world breaches that localized bubble. Greeks, non-Jews, Gentiles who have no ancestral claim to the covenant of Abraham arrive in Jerusalem and actively seek him out.
The reaction of the Pharisees to this event is incredibly telling. The source notes that when the Pharisees see the Greeks arriving, they fall into a state of absolute despair.
They panic.
They do. They say among themselves, "Perceive ye how ye prevail nothing. Behold, the world is gone after him."
The world has gone after him. They realize the dam has broken.
Exactly.
It's no longer just a Galilean movement they can contain within the walls of their religious structures. The influence has gone global.
And according to the source, this expansion from a localized Jewish following to a global Gentile audience was the exact cosmic signal Jesus was waiting for.
Wow.
The world was now coming to him. This indicated that the peak of his earthly physical ministry as a teacher to Israel had been reached. His purpose in that specific phase was fulfilled. The necessary transition from a physical, localized teacher to a spiritual, global savior was locked in.
I'm trying to think of a metaphor that captures the physics of this moment, because it's not just a strategic chess move. It's more like a chemical reaction reaching critical mass.
I like that.
You have elements mixing in a beaker for years,
Okay.
the teachings, the miracles, the localized following. It's bubbling, it's heating up, but it's contained. Then the arrival of the Greeks is the final catalyst drop.
The tipping point.
Exactly. The moment that drop hits the mixture, critical mass is achieved. The reaction becomes unstoppable, and the structure of the container has to completely change to hold it. When the Greeks arrive, Jesus recognizes the critical mass. He knows the reaction has started. He basically says, checkmate, start the clock, the hour is here.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the urgency of the text. Jesus isn't a victim of circumstance, caught off guard by a betrayal on a Thursday night. He sees the critical mass. He knows the timeline. He knows that Wednesday is the preparation day. He knows the Levitical law demands the lambs be examined and slaughtered on that day.
Right.
And he knows that he is the ultimate realization of that lamb.
Therefore, if Wednesday is his predetermined day of execution, Tuesday night is his final closing window of opportunity.
Yes.
It is his absolute last chance to gather his disciples and institute a completely new structural paradigm before the cross.
Which brings us back to your previous question. What was the agenda at the Tuesday supper, if not the Passover?
Right. What were they doing?
The agenda was the deliberate, urgent dismantling of the Old Covenant requirements and the establishment of the New Covenant.
To understand the weight of that shift, the source insists we look at the strict, unyielding rules of the Old Covenant regarding purity.
Oh, this is so important.
Under the Levitical law, physical purity was an absolute non-negotiable requirement to participate in the Passover.
The source cites Numbers 9.6 to illustrate this. The text describes certain men who were defiled by touching a dead body. Because they were physically unclean, they were strictly forbidden from keeping the Passover at the appointed time. They had to wait for a subsequent month. Physical impurity disqualified you entirely.
The speaker also brings up 2 Chronicles 30.18, which is an event during the reign of King Hezekiah.
Right.
A multitude of people had eaten the Passover without going through the rigorous physical purification rituals. Hezekiah actually has to intervene and pray for them, asking God to pardon the people who had prepared their hearts to seek God, even though they weren't physically cleansed according to the strict law of the sanctuary.
These examples really underscore the foundational mechanic of the Old Covenant. Physical circumcision, physical washing, avoidance of physical defilement. These were the prerequisites for interacting with God. It was a law written in stone governing the physical body.
But the source argues that Jesus, sitting at the table on Tuesday night, knowing his execution was hours away, was about to terminate that era.
Completely terminated.
By dying on Wednesday as the ultimate final sacrifice, he was rendering the entire system of physical animal sacrifices obsolete. He was initiating the new covenant, which the speaker notes was prophesied centuries earlier in Jeremiah 31.31.
And this new covenant required a completely different, profoundly more difficult type of purification.
Right.
It was no longer about washing your hands in a basin or avoiding contact with graves. The source utilizes a specific biblical phrase to define this new requirement, the circumcision of the heart.
Drawing from passages like Deuteronomy 10.16 and Paul's writings in Romans 2.29, it's a massive shift from external compliance to internal spiritual transformation.
Exactly. And the stark necessity of this internal purification is vividly, almost painfully illustrated by what the disciples are doing at the table that very night.
This is one of the most deeply human and honestly deeply flawed moments in the entire narrative.
It really is.
As anyone familiar with the text knows, during this supper, a dispute arises among the disciples. But the source frames this dispute not just as an embarrassing squabble, but as the ultimate proof of why the Old Covenant was insufficient.
Yes.
Here is Jesus, fully aware that his hour have come. He is carrying the crushing cosmic weight of his impending torture and crucifixion on Wednesday. And what are his 12 closest friends doing?
They are arguing among themselves about who is going to be accounted the greatest in the coming kingdom.
Unbelievable.
They are politicking for status.
They are literally sitting inches away from the man who is about to undergo the ultimate suffering to save humanity, and they are distracted by their own egos, their own ambitions for earthly power.
The source points to this exact moment as the practical manifestation of Romans 8.7, the assertion that the carnal mind is enmity against God.
Okay.
The human spirit, left in its natural state, is inherently selfish, ambitious, and completely blind to the spiritual reality occurring right in front of it. The disciples had followed Jesus for years. They had observed the physical laws, but their hearts were still entirely carnal. They were uncircumcised in their hearts.
So, recognizing this deep internal defilement in his disciples, Jesus takes action. The texts record that he gets up from the table, takes a towel, pours water into a basin, and begins to wash the disciples' feet.
Right.
Now, usually this event is taught purely as an ethical lesson. We are told it is a demonstration of servant leadership, teaching the disciples to be humble.
But the source insists that viewing the foot washing merely as a moral lesson is a massive underestimation of what is actually happening. The speaker frames this action as a literal spiritual purification ceremony.
Yeah.
It is the necessary initiation for the new covenant.
The evidence for this is in Jesus' specific exchange with Peter, isn't it?
Yes.
Because when Peter initially refuses to let Jesus wash his feet, Jesus doesn't say, "Peter, you need to learn humility." Jesus says, "If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me."
Thou hast no part with me. That is covenantal language.
Right.
That is the language of inclusion and exclusion. Jesus is declaring that this washing is a mandatory prerequisite. He is effectively saying, Peter, your carnal mind is currently defiled by your ambition and pride. I am actively circumcising your heart right now. I am spiritually purifying you so that you will not be unworthy or defiled when you partake of the new covenant.
The speaker's argument is that Jesus had to perform this spiritual circumcision of the heart on Tuesday night. He had to transition them from a physical law written on stone tablets to a spiritual law written on the fleshly tablets of their hearts.
He had to.
If he hadn't purified them internally, they would have been utterly unworthy to participate in the spiritual reality of what was about to happen on Wednesday.
Which brings the entire timeline and theological argument full circle to the warnings issued later by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, which the source quotes extensively to close its case.
Right.
Paul writes to the early church, warning them that whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord.
In the context of everything the source has laid out today, that warning takes on a completely different dimension.
A huge one.
Paul isn't talking about failing to observe the physical protocols of an ancient Egyptian memorial meal. He isn't worried about whether they are eating on a Wednesday or a Thursday.
Precisely. The source argues that Paul is warning against partaking in the new covenant while possessing an uncircumcised, carnal, selfish heart, the exact state the disciples were in before Jesus washed their feet.
Wow.
The worthiness is entirely internal. It is about whether your spiritual lens is clear or if you are still operating out of the intellectual, carnal mind that twists truth to serve ambition.
So we need to step back and look at the massive structure we've just uncovered.
Yeah.
Based entirely on the mechanics and arguments of this source, we have taken a deeply ingrained, universally accepted historical narrative, and we have fundamentally rewired its timeline and its purpose.
We absolutely have. We have mapped a reality where the Last Supper was not a Thursday Passover, but a Tuesday night initiation. Where the crucifixion was executed on Wednesday the 14th, the exact day the lambs were legally required to die, where the high Sabbath was Thursday the 15th, making a Wednesday evening burial logical imperative, and where the term evening means the late daylight hours, perfectly aligning all the events before the sunset.
The implications of this rewiring are just sweeping. When you move the meal from Thursday to Tuesday, it stops being a passive participation in a traditional holiday.
It changes everything.
It transforms into a highly targeted, urgent, and strategic establishment of a new covenant before the biological clock runs out on Wednesday. It forces you, the listener, to shift your focus away from the external observance of an ancient physical deliverance in Egypt and places the demands squarely on an ongoing internal circumcision of the heart.
And this raises an important question. If we synthesize the catalyst for all of this, the arrival of the Greeks, the triggering of the hour, we see a narrative that explodes outward. We see a localized physical promise expanding into a global spiritual reality. The hour wasn't triggered by a clock on a wall. It was triggered by the world showing up at the door, demanding access to the truth.
It's a massive inclusive expansion. The new covenant isn't restricted by physical lineage or the ability to travel to a physical temple in Jerusalem. It requires only the internal purification, the willingness to let go of the carnal mind.
Exactly.
But recognizing this narrative shift also requires us to reconsider how we interact with history itself. If the definition of a single word like evening can be misunderstood, if a Tuesday supper can be seamlessly conflated with a Thursday feast for centuries, what other historical foundations are we blindly trusting?
That is the ultimate warning of the source. We must be fiercely analytical.
We have to be.
We have to recognize the human mind's desperate desire for neatness and tradition, and we must constantly question whether the chronological walls we've built actually align with the original textual foundation.
Which brings me back to the disciples sitting at that table on Tuesday night. They were the insiders. They were the closest to the source.
The inner circle.
Yet they were so distracted by their own carnal ambitions, so focused on who would have the most earthly greatness, that they almost entirely missed the profound spiritual purification and the paradigm shift happening inches away from them.
We almost missed it.
And it forces a deeply uncomfortable question for all of us today. What modern kingdoms, what petty ambitions or traditional arguments are we currently fiercely debating at our own dinner tables?
Oh, that's a great question.
Are we so busy politicking, so busy trying to prove our intellectual minds are right, that we are totally blind to the actual structural paradigm shifts happening in the room with us right now?
It is the perpetual danger of the carnal mind. We get so caught up in the mechanics of our own creativity and our own status that we miss the profound weight of the hour we are currently living in.
It is a heavy, necessary thought to chew on, but that is exactly why we do this. To take the sources, deconstruct the traditions, pull up the floorboards, and see what is actually supporting the house.
Absolutely.
Thank you, the listener, for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep analyzing the text, keep questioning the accepted timelines, and keep seeking those moments where the true foundation reveals itself. See you next time.